We're going to be joined by Eric Sperling with Just Foreign Policy, who is one of these guys who's up on Capitol Hill constantly, kind of just doing the Lord's work, dealing with the swamp, oftentimes in coalition with, let's say, populist, right-wing, kind of isolationist tendencies, trying to piece together enough votes to kind of stop the establishment war machine from just carrying on its business. You've been doing that with a Venezuelan war powers resolution, which we want to get into kind of later in this interview, because you're seeing some movement on that on the House, an attempt to pass a resolution that would block the Trump administration from waging an illegal war in Venezuela. You're seeing Chuck Schumer on the Democratic side saying, we'll do it the second he invades, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because that kind of defeats the purpose, but I'll get you to unpack that. But what's going on now in Washington, for people who are lucky enough to not have to care, is the NDAA. This is a 3,000 plus page bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an kind of annual event here in Washington, because it is considered what's called a, quote, must pass piece of legislation. Like, Congress has decided they must pass this thing. The government has decided they must pass it. So they've all agreed we must pass this thing. That means something has to pass. That means if you have any legislation that you want to get into law, like, this is one of the only vehicles that you can reliably use, and you have to figure out some way to then shoehorn it into national defense. Now, fortunately for people trying to do that shoehorning, our entire economy is organized pretty heavily around the military. So it's not difficult to kind of cram your whatever your issue is. They tried to put an AI legislation into this to basically say that no state could regulate AI. A federal preemption. Ted Cruz tried to put that in. You and some others, helped get that out. Now Trump has done that as an executive order instead. All right, so that's the setup. So it was on Sunday night. The House released what they said is an agreed upon text, 3,000 plus pages. Now, when we say 3,000 pages, we're not talking your typical pages. These are like, what? Seems like 50, 60 words a page. It's like college kids cheating to pad it out, because the margins are tiny, the gaps are huge, and there's lots of nonsense words in there. Still, it's enough to fill somebody's entire cubicle and then some. So the top line, $900 billion of money authorized, which is more than the president even asked for. $400 million for Ukraine. Those were the headline numbers. When you saw it come out, what were the big takeaways from you, and what are the fights that people are looking at, between now and when they try to ram it through?
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I think the big picture is that the trend of obviously increasing military spending has not been stopped. That trend is continuing. The Senate wanted $30 billion more than the president's request, and they ended up agreeing, well, we'll give him only $8 billion more. So, that trend continues. I mean, it presumably has to reach a limit at some point. We have not reached that point yet. We're inching towards that full $1 trillion just in the base budget. That this budget, of course, doesn't include anything in the intel space, or only some of the defense aspects of intel. But you have the entire intel community, which does a lot of military type operations in our country. You have the nuclear budget, and then you also have, of course, the veterans care, which is another $300 billion. All that is related to with war spending. This is just the 900.
Right. So if you added up anything related to war and the consequences of war, including care for veterans, what would you put it at now annually?
It's about 1.5 trillion. If you include, assuming that you think the veterans, the cost of maintaining veterans is part of war, which I think it probably should be considered that. Yeah, you're looking at $1.5 trillion a year. But here we're at just 900, 900. So not quite the full 1 trillion, which is at least a good psychological barrier we haven't crossed. But the big fights here are not necessarily the fights that pro-diplomacy people are thrilled about. You have a provision to Trump has been wanting to reduce the U.S. presence in Europe, which, this could be many. It's been many who have said, well, this is because he loves Putin and Putin has something on him. But putting that aside, people who are pro-diplomacy generally want to see a smaller U.S. footprint. That's what Trump was trying to do. This bill puts restrictions on that, both in Europe and in Korea, and has particular hoops he has to jump through if he wants to withdraw troops from that area. Rand Paul yesterday put out a tweet saying that the troop levels, this is within the president's purview. He's going to oppose this. So that's an interesting dynamic. It's certainly a place where Congress is coming in and saying, when it comes to war, they're pretty unlikely to try to constrain him. It's not been the trend historically, but when it comes to reducing war, they've moved very quickly. This was a big, actually, project of Liz Cheney back when she was still around. So it's impressive that when he does want to pull back, they can act very quickly to restrict his authority. I would say it also provides all types of funding for Ukraine, obviously for the Baltics. There's a whole new initiative, the Baltic Security Initiative, and then you have money for the Indo-Pacific.
That's a little ominous. What are they? Whenever they're doing security initiatives and throwing new money at regions, oftentimes you look back a few years later and you're like, oh, okay, I see why we're at war now in this area. So what do you see going on there?
Yeah, well, this is certainly to reassure the Baltic countries that the U.S. is going to stay in the region. That that just because Trump has kind of expressed, he's basically not shown the enthusiasm for the Baltics that is typical in Washington. So this is Congress coming in and trying to signal to him, to these Baltic countries, that we have your back. We're not abandoning you, and that's really the idea. And you'll see a lot of people who will talk about the Baltics, their leadership, the percentage that they spend on their GDP. But when the U.S. comes in and spend a percentage of their GDP they spend on the military, so the U.S. comes in, gives them all types of military equipment, all types of support, which just only frees them up once again to have more money to spend on their military, also on their domestic situation. So that's, I think the bigger way that it could lead to war is that it essentially decreases the incentive of these countries to have any reason to engage in diplomacy or work out their issues with Russia in a diplomatic way, because they feel they have the military support to take a hard line. And that's the primary way that could lead to a conflict. Right, but of course, if that were to happen, we'd be told it's all Russia's. It's all on Russia, even though, there is a role there in our side and disincentivizing negotiations in that way.
Right. And we understand that dynamic through the lens of Israel too. In the Israeli political spectrum, anybody who was advocating for peace and coexistence was undercut by the United States' willingness to just spend infinite amounts of money to support a war posture instead. So if you were an Israeli politician who said, no, why would we make a compromise with these terrible terrorists? You had the U.S. back. The same thing in the Baltics. Why would we compromise with these evil, like Russians are kind of synonymous with evil, and for some elements of these countries, others obviously are have tight alliances with them. So why would we do that when the U.S. is willing to back us up? When you withdraw that support, all of a sudden peace and coexistence starts to seem like a better deal, in diplomacy. Yep. Actually has a little bit more oxygen to it.
Diplomacy is hard. Diplomacy is tough. There's difficult.
It's unpopular.
Not easy.
You have to do
politically.
unpopular things. Yeah. Right.
So, yeah.
So
well, that's the situation on that, and the same thing with with Korea as well. I mean, the U.S. There is a new progressive government in Korea. They've repeatedly expressed interest in working with Trump to try to tone down tensions, kind of resume the process that was taken in Trump's first term. And, but there's, of course, factions in Korea that are hard right, take the most hostile approach and are aligned with the U.S. security infrastructure, national security elites here. And so it's the same process where, if the U.S. is standing behind the military approach, it undercuts the potential chance for a diplomatic engagement.
Right. So Marjorie Taylor Greene has already come out that she's a no on this. So what are the margins now? I can't keep up with all of these special elections and people dying, and people being sworn in or not sworn in. Also, just want to underline, if people missed this, they took, Adelita Grijalva was elected to replace, her dad, Raul Grijalva, in June, right? In a special election. She was just sworn in, just recently sworn in, because she would have been the 218th vote on this Epstein discharge petition. So they adjourned Congress, stopped business, so they wouldn't have to vote on that, and that she couldn't be sworn in. On last Tuesday, Matt Van Epps beat Afton Bain in this Nashville special election. They swore him in on Friday. Friday. So it turns out they do know how to move pretty quickly when it's a Republican winning a special election. But so update me on the numbers here. So MTG is a no, and she's going to be leaving soon anyway in January. But one of her last acts will be to cast a no vote on this. So how many can they lose? And what kind of leverage does that give you and others who are trying to strip some things out of this agreed upon text? Or is it too late? This is a take it or leave it bill.
It is a take it or leave it. And I think the way that, basically that the Armed Services Committee, which is historically a very bipartisan committee, it is a very well-funded committee from the entities that, do make, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Folks may recall that, this bill passed almost unanimously through committee. Only Ro Khanna was the only vote. And this has become a joke in the Armed Services Committee. In fact, they were chanting Ro, 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 because they were expecting him to vote no. They're almost mocking him, somewhat playfully, but it's a little darker if you kind of see the big picture of what's really happening. So, so it is, and the typical fight for the past few years has been how many, policy riders they put in on cultural issues and social issues. And this year, they essentially toned that down a bit, which allows it to be a more bipartisan bill. Because there isn't really that much dissent on, spending $900 billion on war and whether we should, that's pretty bipartisan. The dissent is over the cultural issues. That's where the disagreement is. So from what we understand, unfortunately, Marjorie Taylor Greene, what she's objecting to is the foreign spending. She was attacking Trump, saying he's too focused abroad. I voted for focusing on America, not spending money in Ukraine, not going around ending foreign wars that we're not involved with. That was her critique. And so that's the line she's taking. Unfortunately, that's the part that she's objecting to, which is all the funding for Israel, for Ukraine, and for Taiwan, and for the Philippines, things like that. That's actually the most popular part of the bill for everyone else. So unfortunately, that does reduce her leverage in the sense that there are a large number of hawkish, Democrats who will probably cross the aisle and make sure it passes, because they wouldn't want her to be able to, her or anyone isolationist, as they would call her, to be able to block the bill. So I think, unfortunately, she has limited leverage at this point because of how they drafted the bill around the consensus issues of lots of military spending and with limited numbers of social or cultural issue riders.
So this is a wrap, you think?
I think that's what it's looking like. We're getting signals that they'll get it over the finish line, barring some unforeseen additional defections. But it seems like seems unlikely that it'll be blocked.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah, Washington knows how to get its bipartisan war spending and war authorization through. So speaking of other uphill fights in Congress, you've also been active in pushing for a war powers resolution. To try to block the Trump administration, or at least the Rubio wing of the Trump administration, from launching its war on Venezuela. What is the war powers resolution? Like, why does it have teeth? And sorry, we got about 4 minutes.
Okay, good.
This one.
Yeah, well, may I just make 2 quick points on the NDAA? There are 2 positive things. One, it's arguably positive. After Syria regime change happened, the sanctions have continued to strangle the economy. So now that the regime change happened, they admit, these sanctions are strangling everybody in this economy. They would never say that while they were trying to do the regime change, but they have finally lifted that after the Trump meeting with the new leader there, former Al-Qaeda guy. So they're lifting those.
So the NDAA lifts the sanctions.
It lifts the sanctions. So that's a good win for the Syrian civilians. It's a little darker in the sense that they only admitted it was hurting civilians once it worked. If the regime change had not happened, they would have not lifted it or recognized that the impact. The other thing it does is it does repeal this 2002 Iraq AUMF. This was the last AUMF authorization for military force that Congress voted on. It was over 23 years ago now, was the last time they authorized anything. Trump had cited it when he assassinated Soleimani. And it's somewhat of a symbolic win to take for the first AUMF to be removed. It has limited relevance, but so that's essentially brings us to kind of what the War Powers Act is and what its purpose is. This was passed after Vietnam because essentially they slowly entered us into that war, starting with advisors and then moving up the chain without any authorization. So they pass a law that allows any member of Congress in the House or Senate to force a vote within 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the chamber, and it doesn't have leadership can't block it. So currently on Venezuela, we have Tim Kaine, Rand Paul on the Senate side, and Thomas Massie, Jim McGovern on the House side, who have these ready. And if Trump does attack Venezuela, these would be ready to be brought to the floor immediately. They could also be potentially brought to the floor in advance here. So that's kind of the state of play. And I think there's a pretty good chance that they would pass, which would be a pretty embarrassing political loss for Trump, given that 70% or above of people in the country oppose a regime change war in Venezuela.
And it does seem like you could bring it up now, because I've seen you point out before that the language of the legislation says that, if you've entered into hostilities, then, the clock starts ticking, and putting the entire kind of armada off the coast of Venezuela clearly is entering into hostilities, setting aside the strikes on the boats, which, they claim for legal reasons are non-state actors. But the whole rationale for it is that Maduro is a narco trafficker, and that these boats are involved in narco trafficking, and the financing then supports the narco trafficking, which is Maduro, but it's a non-state actor. It's like, because it sounds like they're trying to dodge that part of the resolution. But so why don't they just bring it now? Like if they're in now, like just vote on it. And then this is the last question. Then what would be the actual teeth of it? Let's say it passes. What happens?
Yeah, so that's great question. So on the Senate side, they did force a vote earlier, and it was about to pass, but Rubio and Hegseth came to the Hill last day and said, you don't need to pass this. We're not going to war. We promise. We don't even have the authority to go to war. So then they were able to keep just enough Republicans to avoid that loss. But the way that they scrambled showed that they're afraid of a political loss. Trump is wanting to pressure Venezuela, see what can get done through pressure, but he hasn't really committed to taking major political losses, or, especially on an issue that really undermines kind of the theme of his entire America First campaign. So, when it comes to the teeth, that is still pretty contested and gets into some of the legalities of how it's enforced and what their strategies would be. But the reality of these things is that it's largely a very potent political symbol when you have all of, the media is going to be counting votes, going to be reporting the votes, saying Trump delivered a loss. They're going to be looking at the polling. It's going to create a narrative. For example, when Congress passed the first ever war powers resolution, Trump's first term on Yemen, and, Trump vetoed it, said he wasn't going to respect it, but then in the days before the vote, he ended the support for the Saudis that the War Powers Resolution had called for. So the legality is another issue, and it can be enforced, we believe, but that's still an untested legal issue. But the real impact of it is the political cost for the president, who is trying to push an unpopular war that nobody wants, and he barely may even want.
Right. Well, Eric Sperling, thanks for joining us. Where can people find more about Just Foreign Policy and follow your work?
Yeah, I think justforeignpolicy.org or justfp and on Twitter would be great.
Right. All right, Eric. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.